let you know before I started that I've started.
Yeah.
It's now recording, Rebecca.
Okay. Yeah. I
Apologies
see
for
the
that.
little red. That's right. I see the little red button in the corner now.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So I embarked on the PhD at University of Sheffield because I wanted to understand what was it that was going on in the criminal justice system that meant victim participation levels were so low. Because historically, what we're seeing was actually levels were between sort of 7 and 28%. And then Professor Joanna Shapland, who was my supervisor at Sheffield, headed up the Home Office funded RJ study, which looked at whether restorative justice could be successful in terms of with victims of serious offences and with adult offenders. And what we found in her research was that they managed to secure really high levels of victim participation. And we could see that actually in other jurisdictions, there were high levels of victim participation. So it led me to the question to say, well, what on earth is going on within our criminal justice system and organisations that means that we have such low levels of victim participation? Especially bearing in mind that we've got all of the research and data that shows us that when victims do participate, there are really high levels of victim satisfaction. Most victims, or 90% of victims, would actually recommend restorative justice to another victim. And also, when asked, and most people feel that restorative justice would be a good process to go through if they were a victim. So that's what led me to ask this question, what's going on? What are the enablers and barriers? So I spent 4 years researching this question, and that meant that I did a comparative analysis across 2 police force areas in England and Wales to see how RJ was being delivered. So that meant that I looked at all of the criminal justice organisations across those 2 police force areas. So that included PPC funded RJ hubs, victim witness care units, youth offending teams, probation, and RJ facilitators themselves. And I also conducted a number of interviews with victims themselves to see how they had found the process of restorative justice in terms of how the offer was made to them and how they felt about that and whether they participated or not. So I've actually interviewed a number of victims that either elected to participate or actually decided that they didn't want to take part. I mean, what I found amongst those victims were that actually, even the victims that decided they didn't want to participate, there wasn't any really victim-specific factors that were stopping them from participating. And all of them told me that regardless of the decision that they'd made or the stage in which the restorative justice process had got to, they had actually really valued and appreciated the offer. That the offer to them was the most important thing. So I think that kind of shows us a lot about actually that we always think about success and empowerment for victims of being when they actually take part in the RJ process. And we see that RJ process being sort of the gold standard of being a face-to-face, whereas actually these victims participated at in different ways, and that might have just been a conversation with the RJ facilitator, and that to them was really important. So moving on from the victims, as I say, I did the research across a number of criminal justice organisations, and one of those was youth offending, the Youth Offending Service. So the research was across 7 different youth offending teams to understand what the structures and delivery was for restorative justice. So what was the culture, the mechanisms and the approaches that these youth offending teams had, and how did they impact on victim participation? So I just want to sort of spend sort of 10 minutes talking to you about those findings and how these inconsistencies that I found actually really impacted on whether victims participated or not, or even if they were given the opportunity to actually participate. So we're talking about actually were they invited to participate in restorative justice in the first place, because that is one of the big barriers. It's actually about whether they have been invited. And we know from the Victims Code of Practice that all victims should be given the opportunity to participate in restorative justice. However, that isn't what's happening. And if we look at the the crime survey for England and Wales, and we know that actually only sort of on average about just under 7% of victims can actually recall being offered the opportunity to participate. So what's going on within the youth offending teams then? So what I found was actually there was, in terms of victim contact, there were lots of different ways that victims were being contacted. So in terms of the method of invitation, so the method of invitation, the Ministry of Justice and Youth Justice Board's referral order guidance stipulates that victims should have the opportunity, as a matter of course, for a face-to-face with a youth offending team or RJ worker. And they advise sending out a letter prior to calling and offering a home visit. However, the number of, within the youth offending teams, then that victim contact really did differ. A number of victims were subjected to what we call an opt-in process. So they might be sent a letter which says, if you would like to know more about our service, then please contact us. And that would be the only contact that they had. So I think the method of invitation is really important in terms of actually making sure that victims are able to opt out rather than having to opt in. And what we found was actually that some victims were only offered, so they either had a letter, some would have a phone call, and some were offered a home visit. Now, in the youth offending teams that I visited that offered a home visit, then they had much higher levels of victim participation. So actually having that opportunity to talk to an RJ worker is key to them participating in RJ. And I think that we know that actually when you build rapport with people, then it's much easier for them to be able to ask questions or to understand the process. Rather than just sending out a letter saying, do you fancy meeting your young offender? Well, your bold answer is going to be, no, thank you very much. So it really is about building that rapport. The other thing that I found was actually that it depended on the offence, that for some teams, they would only invite victims to take part if the young person had been sentenced to a referral order. So there was no opportunity for victims of young offenders who were being subjected to an out-of-court disposal to take part in restorative justice. And for some of the, if a young person had been sentenced to a detention training order, then victims were cast aside. Many youth offending teams decided that it wasn't appropriate if the young person was serving a sentence. So we can see actually that despite all victims having equal access, they didn't, because actually some youth offending teams say, well, we can only do it for out-of-court disposals. We won't do it unless it's above a conditional portion, and we'll only do it if it's a referral order. And actually, when it then came to referral orders, the way that victims were invited was very different. Many weren't invited for that initial referral order panel, even though they should be. Some of the youth offending teams said that this was around the short window of time that you have in terms of you've only got those 20 days. So, sorry, my phone was just beeping then, so it completely put me off. And also I think there was a lot of, so that's around how the victim was invited. So I think that what we can say there is actually that victims should be invited at whatever the case outcome is, whatever the offence is. So some victims were actually selected out if it was a domestic violence or a sexual offence. And some youth offending teams actually also selected out corporate companies. So however, what we do know from my work in youth offending teams is that actually, corporates, if you do invite them along, then that can be really successful as well. I worked with a young guy who had broken into a local community centre, and that community centre was used by some minority ethnic groups, disadvantaged groups. And when he came along to a meeting with the community community hall manager, then that was really successful. But that was actually classed as a corporate crime. However, that shows that it can be really successful. So then moving on to kind of the structure. So I sort of talk about this, about a culture of restorative justice. So youth offending teams need to have an ethos, this culture that of restorative justice that kind of goes through, that is embedded in everything that they do. So what I found was actually really whether there was a culture of RJ within the yachts depended on whether there was a dedicated restorative justice worker. So where there was a dedicated restorative justice worker, then there were higher levels of victim participation and engagement. Because when you're trying to get all your caseworkers to take RJ on as part of their job, then inevitably it becomes a thing that just gets pushed to the side because it's still seen as this sort of optional extra. And caseworkers don't actually, I think a lot of caseworkers didn't seem to see it as part of their job. It wasn't their job. Their job is to focus on the young person rather than to be focusing on the victim. So where there was an RJ dedicated worker, then you had higher levels of victim engagement, but where the real successes were in the teams that had an RJ dedicated victim worker, and where other team members, so caseworkers, were trained in restorative justice. So that actually, and restorative justice was something that was talked about at every team meeting. The victim kind of took a central position. So that allowed everybody then to feel that they were part of this restorative culture, rather than it just being down to one person or it being a part of everybody's job. And I think that it also, because where the caseworkers were trained in restorative justice, then it enabled them to be having that conversation with their young person right from the offset. So that it was incorporated into that is exactly what was going to happen, that whether they met with their victim or not, then actually they were going to have to take part in some restorative work. And therefore, right from the referral order panel, then it was discussed and it's embedded in their contract. But there seems to also be that for many youth offending teams, there's this difficulty, this kind of blurring of the lines between what is restorative justice and what is reparation. And so it was much easier for us to say, well, we'll do something that's focused for the community, rather than actually getting the victim's views and making sure that the young person was doing something, that the reparation that was victim focused. Yeah, and I think it also now enabled them, I say, just to do that victim empathy work with the young person on a regular basis. And what I also found was that actually when teams were busy, so when there were staff shortages, somebody was off sick, then RJ seemed to be something that got dropped, because that was the easiest thing that could actually be put to the wayside. So even for teams that actually were really had an RJ culture, what I found was that for one of them, they had their victim worker, RJ worker, had gone off sick. And this person, he was absolutely, I mean, he was fantastic in this role. However, when he went off sick, they decided that there wasn't enough staff to be able to cover that. So what they would do is they would no longer make a telephone call or offer a home visit. They would just send out a letter and see if anybody opted in rather than opting out. So they changed that, and no surprise there that actually victim participation levels then dropped. So I think the final thing really is to say is that there was also a sort of a concern that it might not be the right time for the young person, or it might not be the right time for the victim as well. So I don't know if you can see that on the screen. The sun is shining right in my eyes, so I apologise if I'm squinting at you all.
You're slightly spotlighted, I see.
I know it has. I'm going to have to just pull this blind down because I can't see.
It has hit you squarely where you were sitting.
Yeah, that's it. Better now. Thanks. Yeah, so it's just around the decision-making process that actually some youth offending teams made those decisions on behalf of the victim, and also on behalf of the young person. And I think we have to remember that participation is a continuum, and that it should be something that's worked towards, that actually, even if the young person says, no, there's absolutely no way I'm going to get in that room, I'm not sorry for what I've done, you can actually work through with the young person to say, well, actually, how might that feel if that was, if that happened to you? And obviously some young people really see themselves as victims as well. So I found because when I finished the PhD, I was really lucky enough to go and work in a youth offending team as their RJ worker for sort of 7 months. And what I found was that actually a lot of the young people would see themselves as victims and were victims themselves. So I think that through working with them on a weekly basis, for them to understand that, yes, they were, acknowledge that they had been victims themselves, but also to try and get them to have some empathy and see how it might be for the victim, then it's just a matter of really kind of not taking that decision-making process into your own hands, but ensuring that everybody is part of it. And also just to say that none of the victims aren't subjected to secondary victimisation if the situation is handled well and they are given the opportunity to participate, that they can make an informed decision and that they're kept informed. It's only when victims feel that they've been let down, then that's when they start to kind of feel that there's some secondary victimisation. I mean, it's about being, I was going to say, it's also about being creative, that we shouldn't put the face-to-face up there on the pedestal as the creme de la creme, because actually it can just be, as I said, to finish off, that it can just be that initial chat with the victim, and that in itself can be extremely empowering and really help the victim to find the closure and to have their voice heard. So that's my research in a nutshell. So any questions? I'm happy to take questions, and I hope that's been of some use.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I find it so interesting, and it must have been really, I don't know if fun's the word, but really interesting for you and illuminating to dig into that in so much detail and to get under the skin of all the ins and outs of how that works. I don't know if people have questions. So the way we can do it is we just about are okay to do the little button on Zoom to have reactions, and you can raise a hand or put a thumb up and I'll call you, or you can put in the chat that you'd like to ask something, or feel free to sort of wave at me if you're someone who's got your camera on. If anyone's got any. Monica, hello.
Yeah, sorry, I'm a bit confused between Teams and Zoom. I can't find the hands anymore. So.
That's fair enough. Yeah, I think we're all getting muddled between the different platforms we have to use.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you, Rebecca. That was really insightful. And apologies because I was late, so I missed the first bit. So my question was about, was it like a national research that you did, or was it like specific to certain areas of the country? I mean, I missed the beginning, so maybe you
that's fine. I did just give a quick overview. It was across 2 police force areas. So 2 large police force areas, and so 4 different PCC funded RJ hubs and 7 youth offending teams, 3 probation teams and 3 victim witness care units. So to really get an understanding of the victim's journey through the criminal justice system and all of the criminal justice organisations that have some part to play in the victim's journey.
Can you name the police forces or not?
Yes, I can. Yeah, they're Avon and Somerset and Wiltshire.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And that was Chris's question as well, about which police forces. Thank you so much, Monica. And then Demi says, thanks so much, Rebecca. Made loads of notes. Hope you don't mind. Really insightful. And a lot of your findings are things I've observed too, e.g. home visit, invite equals more participation. Thanks once again. And a reminder to everyone that this is now being recorded. So apart from the very beginning, you'll be able to go and watch this back and listen, if helpful, to pick up on little bits of advice that Rebecca's put forward. I actually had a question, Rebecca, that I think is an interesting one, which is around, I'm really interested in the point you've spoken about before about how even making an offer to somebody affected by crime can have a really positive impact on them, even if they say no. one of the things we experience at YME is obviously trying to lobby government and talk to policymakers about showing the importance of restorative justice, and the difficulty is obviously showing evidence of positive outcomes. And that's one of the difficulties there is, when you're trying to make those sort of softer cases to say, look, even when you can't measure a satisfaction rate from this, or even if it wasn't taken up, there were still benefits to it being asked in the first place. And I was curious if you'd come across any ways of like measuring that impact. I don't know whether there's questions in sort of crime surveys around, were you glad to have been offered restorative justice? I think that's probably too detailed to have been in there. I just don't know whether you have any thoughts in how we can capture that finding in a sort of numerical. I'm sure your PhD will help a lot, but in a way of if there's any way to best illustrate it.
I think that's a good point, Ben, because we do need to be able to capture it. And I think if we could, it'd be lovely to do another piece of research that really explores that in more detail. However, it is something that we could incorporate into surveys and any feedback that we get. But actually, the questions that I asked were, sort of loosely, were how did you find the invitation? How were you invited? What did you think? Was the offer made at the right time? Did you mind being offered? And what was your experience? And what I also found was, one, they didn't mind being offered, and they didn't actually mind being offered multiple times. So we think about kind of re-victimizing victims by kind of going back and asking them, do you want to do this? Do you want to do this? Do you want to do this? Well, I suppose it's in the manner that you actually ask that question, but actually it's about letting victims know right from the off that restorative justice is a process that they can take part in, and that they will be offered that opportunity at various points within their journey. Because victims' pain isn't just kind of, it's not, we shouldn't be taking a frozen snapshot of their pain and saying, oh God, they're too traumatized right at this moment, or even for the young person as well, saying, well, it's not right for them. And it's something that should be revisited several times and should be something that is always open for them.
It's really interesting. I think that addresses Chris's point to some extent as well, who asked, did you identify an optimum time to contact victims of crime? It sounds like the optimum time was a number of times if needed.
Yeah, I think what victims said was that it was never too early, but it was too late. So for the victims that were offered, and these were, I suppose, more sort of looking at the victims of adult offenders, but when they were offered restorative justice at the court outcome, so I suppose we can take that to youth offending as well, that when they were offered it at the court outcome, they were already at the end of their journey. So then you're telling this victim, well, this is the court outcome, this is what's happened. We know that dissatisfaction kind of, we have higher levels of dissatisfaction by the time a victim gets to the end of the court system. So if you're then saying to them right at that point, well, I'm telling you all this information, and I've also got this process that you can now take part in called restorative justice. Most victims are tired and dissatisfied. But if it's something that they've already been made aware of right from the beginning, and lots of research there's some research by Tanika Van Camp, she's found, as well as I found, that actually, if you make that offer right at the very beginning, even when they've reported the crime, then you're creating an awareness. You're not saying they have to take part, but it's just making victims aware that they can take part in it, and managing those expectations throughout. Because yes, they might not ever get to know who their offender is, they might not ever get to meet with their offender, but as long as we manage that, then that in itself can be really empowering for the victim.
Yeah, and allows them to feel like their pain is relevant to the system. I know some people feel like it's sort of an add-on.
And they're part of the decision. They're part of the decision-making process. They can decide if they want to take part or not. That's totally up to them, isn't it?
Yeah. No, it is really interesting. And we've spoken before, and I guess not to abuse my chair privileges, but the one final question I had actually was about if you found any interesting dynamics regarding sort of offender-led versus victim-led RJ, because I know that obviously in youth system, obviously there's a very understandable culture of young person first, which has obviously done lots of wonders for youth system, I'd argue. But in terms of restorative justice, that can sometimes sit in a funny way when for sort of victim-led RJ versus offender-led RJ? And did you find any difference in terms of if victims were approached like sort of fresh, like would you like to look into this, as opposed to if they were approached as the person who's committed a crime is now on this particular diversion scheme called X, therefore part of their role will be this. Would you like to help out with that? Does the question make sense?
Yeah, no, totally. No, I didn't find any differences. I only had, okay, I mean, and I have to say it was a small sample of victims. There was 24 victims, but actually there hasn't been that much research done in this area. So I think even that kind of gives us some unique findings.
Sure.
Now, I only have one victim who was dissatisfied with the process, and she was a victim who had been offered restorative justice because the offender had initiated it. And the offender then, who was on, I think it was a community sentence, decided then to pull out. But her anger wasn't actually, when I delved into it, her anger wasn't actually the fact that the offender had pulled out, but it's the fact that she hadn't really been kept up to speed. She hadn't been kept informed. And I think had her expectations been managed more carefully, then she would have been happy with the process, because, as I say, that was all that she was pretty fed up with, the fact that actually it took the RJ facilitator this long to call her. She wasn't really kept informed. So therefore it felt like she had been used in a way.
So it's strung along.
Yeah, but that was one out of all of the others that was the only thing that came up.
Understood. A couple of people had questions about the recording. I'm happy to circulate the recording of this to everyone who's in attendance. And then there was just, before we move on to Tehmina, there was a quick question, one more question from Gwen. And I'll ask you to unmute, Gwen.
I've lost my screen. It's gone a bit strange.
It's okay. We can hear you, Gwen.
Back. Okay. Yeah, I'm an RJO working in Norfolk, and I've been doing it for a little while. And one of the things I found particularly difficult was working with residential homes, for young people. And I would send out our regular letters that had, get the responses. They're well-formed letters, and I would get no response from the residential staff, who tended to be the victims of the young person's offence. So I decided to stop sending those letters because they weren't getting me anywhere, and went and visited the managers of the homes and said, your staff are the most re-victimized victims, and your young people are the young people that re-offend the most, and yet I'm not doing anything here. There must be a job for me. There must be something I can do. And I didn't get anywhere, and they didn't really say anything. And then I went to one finally, and they said, yes, there must be. And I worked with them. I went and did shifts at the residential home. I got into their culture to see what would work. And I started doing circles with the staff. And if we could include the young people in any way, I tend to work quite creatively, big sheets of paper, getting people to write things down, getting responses on those paper. And that has worked, and I wrote about it, and so it was really positive. And I just wondered if you had had any experience and how you had managed that, because it feels like I worked that restoratively very differently from anything else. And it's not always easy. And also I found it quite hard over COVID. I'm now going to revisit it and start doing that again. And I'm going to meet with all the residential unit managers. So I've got quite a good relationship with them all.
I think that's right.
Some of them are private, and some of them...
Gwen, I think that's I was about to say, I think that's really great. I think that we have to be creative. One size doesn't fit all. And sometimes, especially with young people, then they're not great communicators. So it's about saying, well, can you write this down? Can you draw it? Or finding different ways for them to actually communicate. And sometimes, like you say, putting it down on a piece of paper or using a video link can work, or a recording. But I think in terms of actually trying to get into those residential care homes, then I think you just have to keep knocking and going along and actually building that rapport with them really works. So then it becomes part of their culture. Now, if you can get them to have some training in RJ themselves, then it's embedded.
Yeah, they do. They are. We Norfolk, we do train them.
Yeah.
So we have that, and Norfolk residential homes do have to have a restorative basis. But I think the challenge is that the young people who are looked after are often more traumatized. There's more going on in their life, and dealing with doing a restorative piece of work or whatever activity is not that they've just not got the capacity to do that. Sometimes they have. I'm not saying that's a general rule, but many times they haven't, and they keep reoffending. And I felt that the support was needed for the staff. Because they were constantly being battered, if you like, and they needed something to be able to talk about the impact for them, the feelings, and what else they could do. And just as a kind of team, bringing the team together, giving them the opportunity to talk about it with somebody who was totally independent. Yeah. And that for me is a restorative outcome.
Yeah, definitely.
For those victims, even though there may have been no activity with the young person.
Yeah. And then it's also about how can that be fed back to the young people? Is there some way of feeding that back without getting them all together? But I think that is restorative, and actually that is having an impact within that unit. So yeah, it's definitely about being creative. Thank you very much. It's really interesting, Gwen.
Thanks so much for raising that, Gwen. And thanks an awful lot, Rebecca, again, for all of your insights. I think lots of people are scribbling furiously, I think. I'd pass over on to Tehmina now, my colleague from YME, who's leading on a new project called Project Articulate. And it's really interesting stuff that I think people will be interested to hear more about. So I'll pass over on to you now, Tehmina.
Thanks very much for that, Ben. I'm the Restorative Justice Development Officer for YME, and I've been working here for nearly 2 years. Last year, I was working on 2 projects on promoting the use of restorative justice for victims of hate crime, one for hate crime victims in Lambeth and Southwark, and the other for victims of LGBT hate crime. And this year, I am working on this project called Articulate, which aims to widen access to restorative justice for people with English as an additional language needs. This project is funded by the Bell Foundation, mainly firstly for 1 year, but hopefully for 3 years. And it forms part of their broader research into access to justice for people with English as additional language needs, which commenced with a pilot research project last year, carried out by the Institute for Crime and Justice Policy Research and Victim Support. So what is YME's contribution to this? Well, in the first year, we aim to work with 1 regional RJ service, 1 language and cultural group, and 1 to 2 NGOs within a specific geographical area who are working with people who have EAL needs. And we'll be working closely with them to develop a model of practice to work better with people with EAL needs and to meet their needs more effectively. We'll be making use of interpretation and translation services in order to do so. First of all, we'll be running 3 introductory restorative awareness training days for NGOs in this project, and then 1 3-day training session where we aim to train 15 staff and volunteers. There'll be a number of development meetings to embed knowledge and skills, to learn from implementation and to address any issues arising. We also aim to host 1 to 2 national roundtables every year to identify need, barriers to access and solutions. And in fact, the first of these roundtables took place yesterday and was a real success. We had 2 speakers from Victim Support, one of them talking about their research on language barriers in victim care and support, And there were some really interesting findings there about patchy provision when it comes to interpreting services. The second speaker from Victim Support discussed a really interesting project with Urdu speakers in Lancashire, where they're putting together animated videos in Urdu to give guidance and support on specific crimes. So for example, there's a video in Urdu telling people how they might best support a rape victim, for example. And then we also had speakers from YME, so Lucy Jaffe and Belinda Hopkins were speaking about cases they'd worked on with language interpreters. And finally, there was a speaker from Hibiscus Initiatives, the charity that does a lot of work with refugee and migrant women. And they were speaking about their cultural mediation project, which is a really pioneering initiative, which goes one step beyond language interpretation, where cultural mediators are able to explain the cultural context that specific clients are coming from. So this was a really successful event that took place yesterday. What else do we aim to do with this project? Well, we want to contribute to the wider research project funded by the Bell Foundation through contributing evidence, participating in events and discussions where appropriate. We also want to put up a dedicated webpage with information and updates about the work. And this would include video, blogs, case studies about any learning that's emerging from the work. And in year 2, we want to start the test and trial of perhaps a mobile phone app on this project as well. We also want to recruit victim ambassadors to talk about their experience of using restorative justice when they happen to be a victim with EAL needs. And we want to influence policymakers and inspire them to commission restorative and victim services effectively so that they can better serve the needs of people with English as an additional language. Why are we doing this? Well, YME's work on RJ for hate crime has revealed that dissatisfaction is particularly prevalent among victims with protected characteristics, including people with English as an additional language needs, although of course, this is not a protected characteristic in and of itself. Victims of crime with EAL needs often face cultural barriers to accessing the criminal justice system, as well as language barriers, and both need to be addressed. And a lot of this really came out in yesterday's roundtable. Finally, restorative justice has the potential to break down barriers between victims of crime with EAL needs and their offenders, and could have a significant benefit to both parties. That's it from me. I'm very happy to take any questions or comments.
Thanks so much, Tehmina. And I haven't really caught up with you since the roundtable yesterday, so I'm really glad that it went so well. And it sounds like there was some really interesting stuff to pick up from there as well. Okay, so same process I'll ask people in terms of things to raise. You can either use the little reactions button, you can type in the chat, feel free to wave at me the conventional way, or any other things you want to raise. And it'd be really interesting to hear as well about if people have had cases in their services where they've worked with people through interpreters, or where language has been a sort of problem in any ways that they've overcome that, or any other further conversations in that area, because I know that it's something that lots of different services and areas will have to deal with. So does anyone have any points to raise with in those areas?
Yes, Rebecca?
Yeah, sorry about that. I can't use the chat function for some reason. Thank you very much. What I'm interested in is, could you tell me a little bit more what the cultural barriers were? Because I've been doing some work on prisoners and complaints and voice. And what I found is that actually there are a number of cultural barriers. So I'm just wondering what you found and whether they actually match what I've been finding.
Yes, in fact, the victim support project I mentioned, which is supporting Urdu speakers, the reason that their animated video was meant for supporters of survivors of rape was because there would be a big cultural taboo to addressing the video directly to survivors of rape themselves. So they thought that rather than in dealing with that sort of well, of course, they do want to deal with the stigma and the taboo eventually, but they thought that it would be a more effective intervention to create a video where somebody could support a friend who might have been a victim of rape, for example. So that is one example of a cultural barrier. And then in certain languages, you don't actually have words to describe specific crimes. And again, sexual violence, because it's such a taboo in South Asian communities specifically, that's something that you'd be hard pressed to find, for example, Urdu words to describe that even. So that's another issue. And then in terms of the cultural mediation project, the Hibiscus initiatives talked about, they said that they gave me an example of how it was used, where a Lithuanian woman in the UK was a victim of domestic violence. And apparently in certain parts of Lithuania, it's especially rural areas, it's sort of considered normal. It's not even considered a crime. So the cultural mediator had to explain to the judge in this case what this particular victim's cultural context was. And that was how the cultural mediator added value to the whole process.
That's so interesting. And I actually had a follow-up about that, Tehmina, regarding the cultural mediators. And I suppose it might be something we could explore further, but do you know to what extent these cultural mediators work specifically with, obviously the language needs is the focus of the project.
Yeah.
But to what extent can they also be, as far as you're aware, used for other types of difference? So, let's say you had it could be like a trans hate crime or something. Do you know, is the cultural mediating, is it something that can be widened to be used in a wider case of restorative practice?
Oh, absolutely, it should, yes. Hibiscus Initiatives was saying that there isn't much, cultural mediators are apparently not widely used in the UK, they're more widely used in other countries, but they were really sort of emphasizing the fact that we should have more cultural mediators working on different areas, so not just sort of sexual violence or domestic violence, but by all means they could be extended to work on hate crimes, issues where identity is the main feature of the crime. So absolutely.
Yeah, so interesting. And I'm interested in I'm trying to remember from my list about where everyone's called in from, but if you're from areas where there are sort of high populations of people from different communities and sort of a prominent second language, I don't know if there's a common way that your services are used to tackling that or attempting to overcome that.
I was going to say, just while you're waiting for people to respond to that, I think what I found quite interesting is that one of the cultural barriers is around this kind of sort of an ethic of survival, that in some cultures that actually it's not acceptable to be labelled as a victim, taking on that kind of victim status, it is very difficult for them because it's all about, no, I'm okay, I'm not going to take, I'm going to survive, that's what we do.
Which is, it's a difficult thing, which is I know that came up in our work on hate crime as well.
Yeah, I'm sure it did.
Having those views. If people aren't, obviously feeling like throwing in examples, that's obviously grand. We'll circulate the minutes and the conversation, and do feel free to get in touch, because I think that, well, I speak to me, I think the project is, we're very much interested in hearing about how different areas tackle these problems and what the existing practice is. And those things are all very good to hear feedback on. But yeah, thank you so much, Tehmina. Appreciated.
Thank you.
So in terms of our youth forums going forward, I've had a bit of feedback that obviously, understandably, people love to have the dates in their diary in advance, which obviously makes sense. So after the Christmas period, I'll try to get a little schedule, and we'll send out dates up until, hopefully up for the next few months. And, just because everyone hopefully goes back to the office in spring, doesn't mean we won't continue to do these meetings remotely, because I think it's been a really great way to connect people who wouldn't be able to commute down in the middle of the working day to central London anyway. So I don't see any reason that should be prevented. And if anyone has any things they'd particularly like to hear updates on or discuss, or if they'd like to speak about something at a session, you can always get in touch with me. I think you all have my email address, but we use the same format. It's just ben.andrew@y-me.org. So repeating for the recording, that's ben.andrew@y-me.org. So yeah, thank you so much. I think if no one has any other further questions, we can go and have a late lunch. People nodding at the thought of a late lunch. Okay. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's much appreciated. I will stop the recording now.